Hello, my name's Elizabeth Baker. I'm a storyteller. My story today is about a young woman who grew up in Redcar and whose story is told at Kirkleatham Museum. Her name was Gertrude Bell and hers is the most extraordinary story. So, make yourselves comfortable, sit back and get ready for a tale to take you away. Gertrude Bell was born in 1868 in her grandfather's house, Washington New Hall. I should tell you that Gertrude came from a really wealthy family. Not long after she was born, the family moved from Washington to Redcar, to a house called Red Barns. Gertrude's father had had it specially built and he'd used the finest craftsmen. In fact, the inside was designed by William Morris, who you might have heard of. Gertrude might have come from a family that had lots of money, but there was quite a lot of sadness there too. When Gertrude was just 3 years old, her mum really sadly died. Now, like lots of rich children, Gertrude's school life started at home. She was homeschooled. She'd have had a governess, and we know that her dad taught her quite a bit too. And then when she got a bit older, Gertrude was sent to a very expensive girls' school in London. And from there, she went to study history at Oxford University. Now today, we expect girls to go to university if they want to, but that wasn't normal in Gertrude's time. And it wasn't easy for Gertrude and the other girls at university. They had to sit in silence in lectures, and they weren't supposed to ask questions of their professors, and they certainly weren't supposed to talk to the other boys. And sometimes they had to sit with their back to the lecturer. Imagine being taught like that. It must have been so hard. And we know that Gertrude struggled with that and that she did sometimes ask questions when she wasn't supposed to. Gertrude was really, really bright and she graduated. In fact, she was the first young woman to graduate from Oxford with a first-class honours degree. But there wasn't a lot of opportunities for a young woman like Gertrude. Society expected a rich young woman like Gertrude to go out into society. That means she would be introduced to people, she would go to parties and balls, and the aim really was that she would find a wealthy man who she would marry, and that Gertrude's life would be spent running a home, maybe entertaining, but that was really it. And so Gertrude's family prepared her for a life in society by sending her off on a travel round Europe, which was quite common. And Gertrude loved travelling round Europe, but she didn't always do the sort of things that a young woman who was coming out into society would do. There are stories about her going climbing. There are stories about her arguing with men at parties. In fact, she behaved like people expected a man to behave, not really like they expected a young woman to behave. After she travelled in Europe, Gertrude went to Persia, and that's where her love of the Middle East began. Lots of wealthy young women travelled to the Arabian Peninsula, but usually when they travelled, they would travel with a husband or a brother or another male member of their family. Not Gertrude. Gertrude travelled on her own, and when she got there, she hired men to work with her, and her most trusted servant was a man called Fatu. Now, if you and I go on holiday abroad, I'm guessing we pack one suitcase, don't we? Not Gertrude. There are lovely stories and lists of what she took on her travels. She packed fur coats and tweed jackets for cold winter weather, but she also packed very fancy French gowns, and she filled a hat box with all sorts of wonderful hats. Some of them might have been straw hats for the warm weather, but some of them were also very, very elaborate, with ostrich feather plumes and all sorts of wonderful stuff. We know that she packed glass containers filled with lotions for her face, that she packed silver brushes for her hair, that she filled crates with china and silver cutlery, even rugs. Imagine travelling with all that stuff. Do you remember I told you that Gertrude was really bright? Well, she learnt the Arab language very quickly, and soon she could talk to the Arab people and hold her own in conversation. And she got a real reputation for that because she could talk to the people. And the people really, really loved and admired her. They called her Khatoon. Gertrude's real love was archaeology, and she went off on excavations. One of the people that she dug with was a man called T.E. Lawrence, who is always better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Gertrude may have been a wealthy young woman who came from a very grand family, but she wasn't afraid of hard work, and she wasn't afraid of living like everybody else. So on the excavations, Gertrude lived in a tent, and she dressed for an excavation. Gone were her fur coats and her fancy French gowns, and she wore something much more ordinary and much more suited for digging in the ground. That part of the Middle East was all starting to change. The British had taken over, and they decided that they wanted to draw up borders for a new country called Iraq. Gertrude could speak 8 languages. Imagine that. Imagine being able to speak that many languages. And because she was so good at the Arab languages, she soon came to the attention of the British administration. They asked her to come and work with them. She wrote something called a white paper for Parliament. That means she wrote a detailed description of the area. One of the people she worked with was a young man called Winston Churchill. You might have heard of him too. Gertrude worked with a whole group of people to set up a king of Mesopotamia. And she was really involved in choosing who that king was. His name was King Faisal. After the king had been established, Gertrude went back to her real love, archaeology. And the king put her in charge of all of the digs in the area. It was really common for lots of other archaeologists from other countries to come and dig, and quite often the problem with that was that anything they found, they took back to their country. Well, Gertrude was in charge of that, and she made sure that anything on excavations, that half of it was kept for the people in the country. King Faisal gave Gertrude a museum to set up, the first museum of Iraq, and she filled it with all of the things found on the excavations. Gertrude loved the Middle East. She always said in a letter that she couldn't imagine ever leaving the place, and she didn't. Gertrude died suddenly in July 1926 in Baghdad, and she was buried in the British cemetery there. She leaves a huge legacy. The museum, the setting up of Iraq, but also a huge number of photographs and letters and diaries that tell us all about life for an extraordinary young woman living in extraordinary times, but also give us an insight into the beginning of a new country and also the Middle East. She may have been headstrong, she may not always have been liked, but she was an amazing woman working in what was still very much a man's world. But first and foremost, she was a person who loved the country and the people of the Middle East. So let's finish with a letter, part of a letter where she describes the land that she's living in. Baghdad, September the 11th, 1921. Have I ever told you what the river is like on a hot summer night? At dusk, the mist hangs in long white bands over the water. The twilight fades and the lights of the town shine out on either bank, with the river dark and smooth and full of mysterious reflections, like a road of triumph through the midst.